Nations Trust Bank Private Banking is the epitome of elite banking. With its exclusive privileges devoted to providing just the right balance between financial success and lifestyle, our private banking members richly deserve. A financial solution dedicated to excellence, with an unparalleled array of products and services that enrich, enhance, and empower success. A financial solution focused on wealth creation, lifestyle, and the establishment of legacy. A legacy of priority, a legacy of abundance, a legacy much desired. Creating a legacy that's timeless.
So it's my honor to invite Dr. Shamala Ratnayeke for today's lecture of WNPS and for gracing her presence in Sri Lanka from the US. Dr. Ratnayeke works on questions related to ecology and conservation of the two South Asian bears, the sloth bear and more recently the sun bear. Her work investigates species responses to habitat alteration and human disturbances, molecular genetic applications for investigating population, subdivision and isolation, and non-invasive methods for monitoring populations of a wild carnivore. Dr. Ratnayeke is a former Fulbright scholar and US National Science Foundation International Research Fellow. She works with students and colleagues in Sri Lanka, in Malaysia, and in the United Kingdom, and in the United States, with the goal of capacity building in wildlife ecology and conservation science. In fact, on that note, she will also conduct a workshop for 20 university students tomorrow at the WNPS, and we appreciate her efforts to make the conservation of the bear a lot more available for our country. Dr. Ratnayeke, please come on to the podium and deliver your lecture. Thank you very much for your presence.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Let's see. How's the volume? Okay. So it gives me great pleasure to be here, a joy to actually be in Sri Lanka and to talk about some of the work that I did on sloth bears 20 years ago. So thank you, WNPS, for inviting me here and giving me this chance to talk to you all. So a little bit about the sloth bear and the background here. So sloth bears are a member of a small carnivore family called the Ursidae. And there are just 8 species in the family. Most of these species are found in the northern hemisphere. That is, the living bear species. There are a few exceptions like the spectacled bear in South America. Very diverse feeding specializations. You go all the way from giant panda, which is almost completely vegetarian, to the polar bear, which is an obligate carnivore. These are long-lived species. They have slow reproductive rates, few offspring at a time, a lot of investment in the offspring. And because bears tend to be found in areas that are fairly pristine and away from human disturbance, they have often been, and they have large area requirements, they're usually considered umbrella species, meaning that if you conserve bears, you can conserve a lot of species that live with bears. Okay, so Asia has 5 species of bear. And some of you may not be aware that the giant panda, for many years, the classification was a little bit uncertain and it was in its own family, but it's now considered a true bear, but at a very early offshoot of the bear family. Okay, so it's a pretty primitive kind of bear. Now, because Asia has these large human populations, especially tropical Asia, many of these bears are amongst the most threatened in the world. Even the brown bear, which is not globally listed as threatened, Asian populations of brown bears are listed as threatened. They might be endangered or they might be vulnerable. Okay, many of the populations, there's very little conservation efforts, very little knowledge about population status, distribution. Some of this is, these gaps are filling up now, but in many cases there's a critical lack of knowledge. And this is what basically 20 years ago my PhD advisor suggested, why don't you go work on sloth bears in Sri Lanka? We don't know very much about them. And that's how I ended up here. Okay, so if you look at the distribution of sloth bears, they are found on the Indian subcontinent. That's the distribution, okay? The yellow parts correspond to the known distribution. And what you see on the Indian mainland is one subspecies, okay? The mainland sloth bear, Melersus ursinus ursinus. In Sri Lanka, we have a bear, sloth bear, that is considered a subspecies, okay? And it's Melersus ursinus innonatus. So mainland sloth bears, you know, they run about this size for adult males and adult females. You know, as far as bears go, they're kind of medium sized. They're not that big. They might run around the same size as an American black bear. And there's a lot of variation depending on where in the United States these black bears occur. The Sri Lankan subspecies is about 20% smaller on average than the mainland sloth bear. Although there are some records of some very big bears in Sri Lanka. So, but on average, okay, it's a smaller bear and might be a little less shaggy as well. Okay, so what you see highlighted in gray, okay, so this is a bear phylogenetic tree. It's a mitochondrial phylogeny, evolutionary tree. And the highlighted species are the more modern bears, and they're in the family Ursinae. And the sloth bear is one of the earliest offshoots in this family, so it's a pretty ancient bear. An interesting fact about sloth bears is that the first specimen that arrived at the British Museum was classified as a sloth, and it was called Bradypus ursinus, meaning that it was a bear-like sloth. And some years later, the French Museum got a specimen, and they correctly classified the bear, classified it as a true bear. But they called it Melersus libius because they thought it was from Africa. And when things come in ships, you have specimens all thrown together, and they believe that this was an African bear. But Africa has no bears, at least no living bears. So a few things about sloth bears and what makes them unique. They're specialized for feeding on termites. And they've got some very unique adaptations to help with this process. So they're very heavily built forelimbs, shoulders and forelimbs, and long claws on the front legs. These long ivory-colored claws. If you look at this photograph, the flap of skin on the nose, over the nose, that's something that can actually be sealed, that can be used to seal the nostrils tightly shut while the bear is feeding, because it's got its head in the dirt and it's snorting up, basically not snorting, it's sucking up termites using suction. And so it protects the nasal passages. This picture shows the lips of the bear. Sloth bears have really loose and long lips, and we think that this might actually help with suction feeding as well. I'll show you a picture in a little while, okay? So this is a bear that there's a tranquilized bear. When we pull the upper lip back, and let me see. Sizes are missing on the bear, and this is also believed to help with suction feeding. So what happens is that the bear digs a hole and in a termite mound, and then he sticks his snout in, gets his lips around the hole, and vacuums, literally like a vacuum cleaner, snorts in the termites and the grubs and the eggs and quite a bit of dirt at the same time, if you've looked at a sloth bear's cat. Okay, and you can hear them feeding from quite a distance away. So some other unique features of sloth bears, if you look at the forefoot and the hindfoot, okay, it's completely naked, there's no fur on it. And I'm showing you a sun bear, which is another tropical bear, where you have some hair on the forefoot. And the other thing that you will notice is that the digital pads, okay, these are the digital pads, they're completely fused, okay? They're joined together with skin. They're not separate like in the sun bear and other bears. And you see this on the hindfoot as well, okay? No hair on the hindfoot, hence the barefoot bear, okay? And the sun bear hindfoot, again, you can see the separate digital pads and some hair between the carpal and the digital pads. So sloth bears have a very long and close relationship with their offspring. Bears love their babies. Sloth bears especially seem to love their babies because they carry them around pretty routinely, and it's the only species of bear that will carry its young to this extent. Okay, black bears and brown bears, the young might climb on the back of the mother occasionally, but with the sloth bear, it's almost, for the first 3 months, the young will ride on the mother's back almost all the time, and after that, they will come down occasionally and feed off the ground, but if the mother is traveling, the cub's on the back. And so you can see there's a fairly energetic cost for the mother to haul around a cub that size. So some of the conservation issues, okay, the global listing for the sloth bear is it's vulnerable, okay? And in Sri Lanka, this is what I could find online, the national listing, the red listing, which is 2012. There might be a more recent one, but it was listed as endangered, where they feel that the sloth bear, the status, it's actually more threatened, okay, than the global status. So at the time that I was working, that I started work on sloth bears, there actually was a fair bit of anecdotal information on the ecology of bears. We know, we sort of had an idea of where they were found, what they ate, things like that, but no solid information on where bears occurred on the island, and no solid information on population status, okay? And that, the last one, population status, we really don't know, okay? We still do not know. Was there poaching for lots of species of bears, okay? Bear parts fetch a very high price. Was it going on in Sri Lanka? I wanted to know. Were there conflicts with people? That was another big question. And so that's what I went into. So what I'm going to do today is I'm basically going to talk about the study, okay, and what we found. And we'll finish off with perhaps some of the priorities that I think, and I might not be right about it, but what I think may be a direction that we could take. So my work started in 2000 when we did a pilot study, and then we came back in with funds and with more funds, and really started fieldwork in earnest. The population of Sri Lanka was about 20,000 million people at the time. We had an ongoing civil conflict. And so my objectives were, Lakshman, I apologize for putting text on your photograph. I wanted to get some basic ecological data, okay, on bears. So we captured bears, we radio collared them, and got some really nice information about behavior and space use. We looked at distribution, okay, of bears on the island, and I was also able to do some work on human sloth-bear conflict. So the ecological study was at Waskamoa National Park, okay, which is a fairly small national park. You all know where it is. It is mostly dominated by dry monsoon forest, which might be called different things, okay, depending on which publication you look at. So if I'm offending any foresters by calling it dry monsoon forest, please forgive me. You know what I mean, okay? Dry evergreen forest is another name for it. There's patches of scrub and grassland in the south of the park, and most of the park is surrounded by villages and agriculture. So this was, we had a small team, okay? So we have Karu, who is the wildlife officer who worked with us most of the time. We had several people from the Department of Wildlife staff who worked with us, but Karu was probably our most faithful and tolerant wildlife officer, willing to put up with the long hours. He complained a lot, but he went along with us. Rohan Pires, who is in Kilinochchi at the moment, and Bandara. And then between Rohan and Bandara, that's Frank, who's been a collaborator. He was a fellow graduate student. We have worked together for many, many years and continue to do so. The first thing that we did was we basically set up bear traps. We wanted to capture some bears and put radio collars on them. So this is 1.5 diesel barrels welded together. These were locally made. And what you have along the top of the trap is you have a conduit, okay? And there's a cable that runs through it, and you hang some bait at the end of it. And if an animal goes in and pulls on the bait, then it pulls the door shut, okay? The door drops down. And so we had several, so I admit that we were really we didn't really know what we were doing initially, okay? We didn't know how to get the bears into the traps. And then we finally went in with, we worked on bees honey, and the bears were just passing the bees honey, they were ignoring it, you know, in the traps. So we hung it along the footsteps where the bears were walking. We hung bees honey from the trees in little plastic jars covered with cloth to keep the ants out. And when the bears recognized that as something sweet, they started going into the traps. And so we had the traps basically set up with the doors propped open where they wouldn't come down so that the bears would feel comfortable going in. And we had to have the wildlife vet with us, Dr. Vijitha Pereira, okay? And he was 40 kilometers away, and so he couldn't come in every day and just check to see whether bears were in the traps or not. So when we were really sure we're going to get some bears, okay, we contacted him and said, be here in the morning. And we set 7 traps. And 5 of the traps were visited by bears, and all the bears had escaped. So what had happened, on the door, do you see those 2 holes? Okay? The man who made the traps put those holes in to help us to lift the door up and down. So what happened is when the bear gets into the trap and rolls it about and stuff like that and gets really upset, after he calms down, all it needs to do is to just insert its paw into the door and move it in the right direction. And that's what happened. So we anchored the traps using wire rope, and we spent a few days to get the doors covered with sheet metal, and we made sure that we only set 4 traps so that we wouldn't have to work up 5 bears in one day. And things went pretty smoothly after that. So we caught the bears and you know, we tranquilized. I don't have a lot of pictures of this going on because nobody was taking photographs. We were busy doing the work. We got measurements and weights using, as you can see, pretty non-technical approach here. Spring balance, that's Dr. Vijitha Pereira on the left. And we fitted the bears with radio collars. These had a battery life of 2 to 3 years. And they had activity sensors in the sense, meaning that when the bear had the collar on, we could tell whether the bear was asleep, whether it was moving, or whether the bear was dead or the collar had fallen off the bear. And we had a spacer on the collar. You see this gap. I'm a little afraid to, well, here we go. See this, if you can, whoop, see, I told you. So there's a gap in the butyl chloride that forms the collar. And what it does is, we have a leather spacer in there, and the butyl chloride will last a lifetime. It won't come off. And so we didn't want the bears to be wearing the collars all their lives. We put in a spacer that would rot within a year, and the collars would naturally drop off as a result. Okay? And so we used the transmitters to get data on bear locations and calculate home ranges, look at activity patterns and habitat use. So we tranquilized the bears using a mixture of ketamine hydrochloride and xylazine hydrochloride, which is fairly standard for tranquilizing bears through most of the world. And we administered an antidote called Uhimbim, and that's given under the tongue. And once you administer the Uhimbim, the bear gets up within a minute or so. And most bears will run away, but sloth bears don't do that. They stay and they create a big ruckus. And we all got into our vehicles, and this is Dr. Vichitha's vehicle, and the bear is charging his vehicle and creating a huge, I mean, a lot of noise, and very, very worked up by the whole situation. And then he turned around and charged our vehicle. And then after a while, they get tired and they go off. And so once this was done, so this is the easy part, okay, capturing the bears and putting the radio collars on. Then the difficult part comes with collecting the data. And this was a lot of work. And we basically either homed in on the bears or we triangulated to get locations on them. Fortunately, most of our bears were caught close to the roads, and we did this on purpose to facilitate the radio tracking. And here's a picture where we homed in on a bear. This was a female and a cub that was resting in this, I would call it a thicket. And Rohan's sitting in there, and you can see how difficult it would be to see a black object, a black furry object lying in there, okay, because it's so dark. And when I talk about human-bear conflicts, I want you to think about this, of this picture. So I'm not going into all the technical details. I'm just sort of summarizing some of the key takeaways that we found here from habitat use. We found that there was I won't call it a preference, but a tendency to use tall, dense forests more than expected based on the availability, okay? And scrub forests and grasslands were less used. So where you see the badger mongoose or the striped neck mongoose, that would be an example of habitat that is used by bears, but to a lesser extent, okay? And I thought I'd show you this as well in terms of activity, because it has a lot of relevance when we get to human-bear conflicts. If you look at the time of the day, okay, between 8 and about 4 p.m., the hottest times of the day at Waskamua, you had very little activity from the bears. And whatever activity that you're seeing there was probably mostly in the monsoons when you had pretty overcast skies. So the bears actually tended to shut down and rest or get into cover during the really hot times of the day. And then, 6 o'clock onwards till dawn, they were up and about. So so some of the unique findings here also was that these bears had very small home ranges, okay? And there's a lot of overlap in the home ranges. So in the figure up, there I've got the home ranges of 6 male bears, okay? And you can see that there's a fair bit of overlap between different males. And with females, we had the same thing. There are 4 females on the lower figure, and basically the male home ranges would lie right over the female home ranges. Okay, I hope you heard that. I had a lot of hesitation about saying something about this, but I had actually talked about this in the paper. And Anoma and Charles Santhia Pillay published a paper in 1990 where they estimated, and they acknowledged that it was a very tentative estimate, that there's huge amount of uncertainty around it, but they looked at some calculations made by Eisenberg, I think many, many years ago, and he came up with, at Ruhuna National Park, a density of 5 bears per 100 square kilometers. And so they calculated just in the national parks, you might have 300 to 600 bears in Sri Lanka. Now, if you look at the home ranges, okay, and you look at that little box on the side over Waskamua, that's where the home ranges are. In less than, it's just a small part of that box, and we had 10 bears there. And we had overlapping home ranges, and we also saw unmarked bears during our study in this same area. So we basically concluded at that time that the Waskamua may have more than 100 to 150 bears at least. Okay? In 2004, when we looked at the distribution of bears across the island, Waskamua comprised less than 5% of sloth bear habitat in Sri Lanka. You can't just extrapolate these numbers, okay, because the quality of habitat varies greatly, and Waskamua, I would think, is probably one of the best habitats for bears, but there are also very good bear habitat in Dambakota and Galge and Wilpattu. And so this is just an idea that, you know, at the time, our findings were that the bear populations were probably doing fairly well. But we have no idea about mortality and poaching and hunting and, you know, bears being, you can have good habitat, but you might not have bears. Okay, so some of the key conclusions from this was that small national parks, okay, that are around 300 kilometers square, Waskamua, for example, they can support bear populations, and that's good news. Old growth forests seem to be important, okay? Much of Waskamua has some nice tall Mukalana forest, okay? Big tall Vera trees. You have cavities for dense sites. The older trees are going to be more productive in terms of fruit, cooler temperatures, and possibly better conditions for termites as well, and easier to forage for them as well. If you want to look at the technical details, here are a couple of papers. We also did some remote camera work where we looked at sloth bears and their relationship with other carnivores. So this is in the literature. What I want to do here now is to talk about the sloth bear distribution survey, okay? And we did this in 2004. And the reason behind this is we didn't know exactly where in the country we had sloth bears. Santhia Pillay's paper pointed out the major national parks that had sloth bears, but there's a lot of habitat outside the national parks as well. And so we wanted to actually survey these areas. And because we couldn't safely do it, because most of sloth bear range lies in the northern and eastern provinces of the country, which were areas of active civil conflict, there was a peace, what do they call it? A ceasefire during that time, okay? And so we got permission from the Army and the LTT to go into the north and the east. We were able to go in with, so up there you see Rohan and Pragash talking to a hunter. Pragash was a student from Vaunia campus. Charles put us in touch with him, Charles Santhiapillai. He was a wonderful, wonderful field worker. Pragash joined us on the field surveys, and then we were not allowed anywhere to the east side of the northern province because that was Prabhakaran's stronghold, and so Pragash was allowed to go on, he was able to basically get on the back of the on a motorbike with an LTT officer and survey those areas. In fact, in the lower middle picture, here again, let me see if I can do this without changing the screen. This is, so the arrow is actually on an LTT officer. He must have been about 15 years old, who went with us on some of the surveys in the north. And so what we did was, we talked to hunters and forest users and asked them about the presence or absence of bears in their area. And that is how we got a lot of our information, okay? Especially in the north and the east. Some of it we were able to combine with what we knew about bear sign and where we had seen it, but a lot of it came from this kind of survey information. And this is me in an area talking to a group of elders. There were no sloth bears in the area at the time, but he was telling me, 5 or 6 years ago, there were sloth bears here. So we covered basically what we consider the historic range of the sloth bear, okay? We used the 5-kilometer grid that all our 1:50,000 maps are made of, so that made it really simple because the grid is laid out on the map. And we got, what you're seeing on the right with the red dots, this is where people reported or confirmed that there were sloth bears present. And so we used that information in an analysis, okay? For each grid cell, we calculated some landscape characteristics, the percent monsoon forest, elevation, and 6 covariates, okay, that we thought might have some influence on the presence or absence of sloth bears. And we used logistic regression to basically come up with a probability of presence or absence in the historic range of the sloth bear. And this is what the predicted distribution was based on the logistic regression analysis, okay? And there were 4 covariates that were significantly associated with their presence. The more monsoon forest, so monsoon forest was a positive predictor, okay? The more monsoon forest that you had in a grid cell, the greater the likelihood of sloth bears. Road density, population, human population density, and elevation were all negative predictors, meaning that if you had more roads and a higher human population or a lower elevation, you're less, I'm saying a higher elevation, the less likely you are to have sloth bears, okay? Negative predictors. So elevation, sloth bears are a low elevation species. About 90% of their range is under 300 meters. So the nice thing about this model was that it has some utility over time. And so what we did was in 2015, we updated the land cover or the landscape covariates like road density, forest, and the percentage forest and human population density. And we looked at where sloth bears might be. And what I want you to pay attention to are the white check marks, the white boxes on the map. And this is where the model predicts that bears that were previously present are now absent because of landscape changes, okay? And based on the calculations, it looked like an 8% loss of bear habitat between 2000 to 2015. nevertheless, 43% of historic bear range still remains conducive for bears, but I would say less than 43%, okay, because not all grid cells are completely occupied by bears. Interestingly, connectivity may still be high, but if you look at Wascamo National Park, for example, you see the loss of connectivity, okay, with some of the other areas. And so a lot of the erosion of bear habitat seems to be on the boundaries of the range, including some of the national parks. So I have no idea what the time is. Okay, so I have a little bit of time, right? Okay, so I want to talk about human-sloth-bear conflict here. And while we were doing the survey, we realized that here was a great opportunity because people told us, you know, in this area. So we realized, hey, we can get information on human-sloth-bear conflict. And we met this man walking along the road, and we stopped and asked him what happened. And he invited us into his home and told us his story. He was attacked when he was 14 years old. He had gone into Vilpattu National Park with his father. The father had wanted to cut fence posts for a chainer. And he had wandered off to eat berries, and he was at a thicket picking these berries. And then he realized that there was a female bear lying in the thicket on her back, feeding her cubs. And by the time he turned to run, the bear was on him. Knocked him down to the ground and attacked his, damaged his face. I mean, he had serious injuries. He had lost his nose, he had a jaw fracture, he lost a lot of his teeth. His father heard the yells, the screaming of the bear, and came running and used his axe, and he brought his axe down on the back of the mother bear and broke her back. One of the cubs attacked the father. He dispatched the cub. And he carried the boy back to the village. The villagers came back to the site. They found the injured mother bear, and they stoned her to death. So I'm talking about this example because it gives you an idea of what the consequences of conflicts are, and that someone who survives a bear attack like this is basically, it sends a symbol or a signal to the entire village that this is an animal that is seriously dangerous. So this is a map of human population density, okay, in Asia. And you can see that India and Sri Lanka, which is where sloth bears occur, okay, are one of the most human-densely populated areas in the world. And sloth bears are responsible for more attacks on humans than any other species of bear. They leave every other species of bear in the shade, okay, in terms of attacks on humans. So Madhya Pradesh, in a 5-year period, they documented 735 attacks and 48 human deaths. In Chhattisgarh, 137 attacks just in 1.5 years and 11 deaths. And in Sri Lanka, over a fairly long period, this is our data, we got data on 271 attacks and 3 deaths. I put this picture up here because I thought it was really pretty cool, because it gives you an understanding of why sloth bears are like they are, okay? They evolved in habitat with other large predators, and YouTube is rife with examples of sloth bears having encounters with tigers or with leopards, and sometimes the tiger kills the bear, sometimes the bear gives the tiger a licking of its life. And so these are two large carnivores that really have a testy relationship, and bears and leopards also have conflicts, and I'm sure most of you who have been to the national parks might have witnessed some of this. Okay, so conflicts were undocumented at the time in Sri Lanka, and I guess the reason for this is that a lot of people didn't report it because they were illegally in an area, okay, doing something, and so they got attacked. But what it does is, conflict doesn't help conservation, okay, because it reduces tolerance for bears, and it creates this tremendous fear, and then hunters or people that enter the forest, if they've got a firearm and they think that a bear might actually be approaching them and might attack, they might kill the bear, even though the bear might not be even aware of their presence. There are few efforts to resolve conflict in most of sloth bear range. And one of the things that I wanted to look at were what are the circumstances that are around these bear attacks, and is there anything that people can do to reduce the chance of being attacked? And India, there's quite a bit of information coming from India now also on this whole business of attacks, because India has very serious, especially in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, they have very intensive sloth bear conflicts with people, and it's mostly attacks. So this was a really fascinating part of the survey. People were so happy to be able to tell their story. This man, villagers knew about him 40 kilometers away. Somebody got into the vehicle and took us to him. He was so happy to see us. He went into his chena and he uprooted some manioc and boiled it and insisted that we have lunch. And there's Rohan sitting there and eating lunch, having lunch. This is one of the Aboriginal people of Sri Lanka, the Vedas. He is actually missing an eye from an encounter with a sloth bear. This man was attacked by a bear. He had gone out in the afternoon to get some meat, wasn't successful. He had unloaded his gun and was walking back. He went around a termite mound. There was a bear at the termite mound. He turned to run, ran for a tree, jumped up. The bear got him by the leg, by the foot, fractured his foot, dragged him down. And he said that he got attacked, he lost an eye, a lot of severe injuries on his face. He said that he could not fight the bear back, and so he played dead, and the bear left. But he was too injured to go back to the village. And the next morning, so he slept the night in the forest. The next morning, the villagers came and found him and carried him back to the village and to the hospital. Serious attacks, okay, on people. These are some of the most severe of the injuries where people lost eyes or parts of their face, or a broken arm, broken wrists, and so on. So very, very, I would say, fascinating stories fascinating experience to listen to their story and realize what they had gone through. Okay, so we mapped bear attacks based on, and this is based on the approximate location, okay, because many people couldn't give us the exact GPS coordinates of, I was attacked right here. So basically they could look at the map and they could tell us it was X number of kilometers from this particular landmark. And so we were able to get an approximate location. Many of them admitted to being in the national park, okay? But we think that many are in the national park, so you can see quite a lot of attacks along the edges of national parks and protected areas. And the white dots, which I hope you can see, these are the older attacks, okay? The black dots are the more recent ones, or were the more recent ones. So attacks in the last 20 years. So what are some of the key things about this, okay? In Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh, it's fairly common for people to go out into their backyards and be attacked by a bear. And attacks might take place at night or early morning when people are going out, they don't have a toilet, they go to the forest to use the bathroom, and they encounter a bear and they get attacked by a bear. You didn't see this, we didn't see this in Sri Lanka, okay? So attacks in villages were very rare, and most attacks occurred in forests. So what was happening is people were going into the forests, and this is where the attacks were occurring. We just mapped the frequency of attacks by rural human population size, okay, in millions. And you can see that as rural human population grew, the number of attacks also increased greatly, okay? Now, some of this might be that we missed some of the older attacks because people had died or they had moved. But there seemed to be a pretty strong trend here. So when were most attacks occurring? During the middle of the day, okay? A fourth of the encounters involved more than one adult bear. And so you can see where the frequency of encounters were in the middle of the day. What were bears doing or likely to be doing during that time? Resting, sleeping, okay? Probably in one of those thickets. And when we asked them, how close were you when you were aware that the bear was there? Most people said it was less than 5 meters. In 100 of those attacks, they said the bear was less than 2 meters from them. So they didn't have enough time to even use a firearm or an axe or find a way to protect themselves. So many of these were almost like an ambush. It's not really an ambush. It's not like the bear calculates, I'm waiting for this man and I'm going to attack him. The bear, basically, a human approaches, the bear loses its nerve and attacks. None of these attacks were predatory, okay? Basically, it's an invasion of space where a human gets too close to a bear, the bear feels threatened, its way of responding is to attack, okay? I will also say that in many instances, bears run away, okay, when they encounter a person, and that probably occurs most of the time. Okay, now in India, okay, you also have crop raiding, which it was almost absent. I think one time a man saw a bear in his banana plantation and he wasn't even sure that the bear was raiding the bananas, okay? But in India, potatoes and peanuts are routinely raided by sloth bears, and here you have sloth bears in fragmented habitats surrounded by villages, degraded habitat, and what might be happening is that the bears have no alternative but to raid crops to survive. So what we did was we ranked attacks based on an ordinal scale from light to severe, okay? And severe attacks, or light attacks, would have been very superficial lacerations or scratches, whereas a severe attack, well, death would be pretty severe, okay? But the loss of eyes, teeth, scalp, you know, any sort of injury to the head, fractures to the head or the major limb bones, we consider that severe. And then moderate and moderately serious, we put them somewhere in between. And we looked at how often was this person alone, okay? And so we had 71 attacks that we ranked as serious attacks, where the injuries were very severe, and usually that happens with a prolonged attack, okay? And the victim was alone. Or if he was with a group, everybody ran, and he was the one that the bear caught. So he was essentially alone, okay? Moderately severe also. We had a fair number of cases where the victim was alone, but when we get to fairly light attacks, okay, not very serious attacks, in this case, just the presence of one companion or a small group of people was enough to possibly discourage the bear from persisting in the attack, okay? And one thing that we don't have here is we only interviewed people who had physical contact with the bear. How many times do you think that a bear runs off and it sees a group of people and there's no physical contact, okay? So staying in a group or having a companion that doesn't run off and leave you or abandon you, and I must say that it can be a very frightening experience to be charged by a sloth bear. This is something that seems to be, we've seen this with grizzly bears and we've seen this with American black bears, okay? The presence of other people is your best measure of protection. And sometimes they don't need to do anything, they just need to be there. And the bear perceives a larger organism or a bigger threat and might be much less likely to persist in the attack. Now, I do describe 10 serious attacks where the person was not alone, okay? But statistically speaking, your best bet is to have a companion, okay, or a group of individuals. Okay, so in terms of conservation, okay, attacks, bear attacks. If you're a conservation biologist, you really want to know, all right, bears are attacking people, we have lots of people, we're not losing people, but are we losing bears? Does it actually, could it have an impact on bear populations? And I think it could, because if you look at the number of attacks where bears were wounded and killed, that was about a third of the attacks that we documented. In about a third of those attacks, you had bears that were seriously wounded or killed. Okay? When we did the survey, 65% of rural hunters admitted to killing sloth bears. It might have been, all right, I killed a bear once, or I killed a bear twice because I felt threatened. Some of them would actually routinely kill sloth bears, okay, because they felt fewer sloth bears means greater safety. Whether these values or perceptions have changed over time, that's something that would be good to look at, okay? So sloth bears, the interesting thing is that although most of the people that we interviewed, okay, and these are hunters and forest users, regarded sloth bears as a threat, the vast majority of them felt that the presence of sloth bears was better than the absence of sloth bears, okay? So maybe it could be, we want sloth bears to be around, just not in my backyard, okay? These are a couple of the publications where we published the data on the bear survey and the bear attacks. And the book summarizes or talks about these different studies in less technical detail. Okay? I don't like reading scientific papers, and I'm sure many of you don't either, because the technical jargon is quite discouraging. Okay. So moving forward, okay, something that the bear specialist group has pointed out, and these are Asian bear specialists, they feel that it's fairly critical that we monitor sloth bear populations, okay? And why do we need to do that? It's not that one snapshot in time of getting a density estimate or a distribution map. It's the change over time that is important, because if the trend is declining, for example, you will know, then you have to find out what are the causes for the decline, and then there needs to be some conservation intervention, okay? So monitoring over time and looking at trends, that is important, and finding ways to monitor bears cheaply and efficiently, I think is really critical for most of us in Asia, where we are working on pretty shoestring budgets. So there are 3 monitoring methods that we can look at in order of decreasing geographic scale, and one of them is looking at changes in geographic range, which is what I did. But that's practical for larger areas, okay? When you're looking at smaller areas, you can look at changes in occupancy, and that's basically a probability estimate that a particular site is occupied or not. And then, of course, you can go to changes in density, and then you're looking at a smaller scale because it's really impractical to do it countrywide, okay? And looking at the numbers of individuals, and here you must be able to identify individuals, okay? And it looks, you need a pretty rigorous study design. And so currently, spatial capture-recapture is one of the best models out there that we can use for density estimation. I saw a leopard study that had recently come out that used spatial capture-recapture at Wilpattu, and open population spatial capture-recapture. Okay, so both of these probably give you the best estimates, especially when you're looking at bears, okay? And if you want to get a certain amount of precision that is useful, okay, for monitoring population trends. If you don't go with a good study design, you will have a population estimate, but it might not be of much value because the error around those estimates might be so big. Okay? Legal protection of existing bear habitat. This is important, okay? This is a screen capture of a part of northern Ruhuna. What are all those little light green squares out there? Okay? That looks like forest clearing for chenas. And is it a commercial operation for ganja, or is it a poor villager who has gone in there to set up his chena? I think if you get on Google Earth, you can get a GPS coordinate on that, and you can actually target where to go and survey and where to target your law enforcement operations. I think this is fairly critical because you're looking at some of the oldest, most valuable old-growth forest in the country, and that is one of the best habitats for sloth bear. Okay? Now, finding out why people are doing this and can we give them an alternative, it's an extremely complex question, okay? But it's something that needs to be addressed because what you're going to see is progressive fragmentation where you're going to lose large extents of valuable forest. And then finally, there's no hope for conservation independent of human needs. And so for many people that live around the national parks, for example, they might be living pretty marginal existences. And finding over time, if we can find ways to give them a more secure livelihood where they don't have to go into the forest. Okay? So what I'm thinking is, if you keep people away from the forests, there's less bear conflict and less bear mortality as a result of the conflict. And so I'm going to end with a big thank you to WNPS for giving me the opportunity to talk to you, or to all of you. There are numerous people that I have to thank to be, that this study, that allowed me to get this study through. Rohan Petiagoda is here. I'm happy to see his intervention was critical, okay, for my study to be able to proceed because it was halted after a few months due to a false rumor. And my thanks to several of the wildlife staff and who worked with me, and the range, the wardens who assisted my work. So thank you, everybody. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
It's time for Q&A. We'd like to, just one reminder, we need to keep our questions very precise and on the subject. It's not a time to make statements. We need to stick to asking very precise and relevant questions. Thank you.
Just a quick question. You didn't talk much about poaching. Does it happen, and is it happening in Sri Lanka? Is it happening in India? What's the status?
So in terms of poaching for bear parts, when I was working in Sri Lanka, we did ask about it, and except for one instance where they said that somebody, this was a foreign company that was working on the roads, had asked for bear paws and bear gallbladders. Just one instance. So I would say that it was very low at the time. In India, you have the sale of bear parts across the border into going into East Asia. Okay. In Sri Lanka, I think it was pretty low at the time of the study, but it's something that I think we need to be vigilant about. Because I'm sure that considering the price of gallbladders and bear paw, that this would be a pretty lucrative way for someone to make a living. I mean, in Malaysia, we can't even talk about the locations of tigers where they were seen publicly because poachers target these areas. So pangolins, tigers, sun bear, okay, all of these, and we have poachers coming in from Vietnam and the Philippines, from overseas, just to get these very valuable animals. So I think it's something that we have to be vigilant about. Yeah.
Could you tell me whether the Himalayan black bear, is the Himalayan black bear a stock killer?
The Himalayan black bear,
Yes.
yes, it can be in some situations.
And the American black bear?
Very rare,
Very rare.
very rare, yeah.
Brilliant talk, Shyamala. Thank you so much and congratulations. Fantastic body of work. Just wanted to ask a few quick ones. You showed your first distribution map. In India, it looks like the bears occupy a much wetter region in the south of India than in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
What's the ecological difference going on there?
I don't know.
All right.
It's something that I have wondered about too, because you have bears going up into the Western Ghats at, 8,000 feet above sea level, and we don't have bears in the hill country. So in the tea country, you have bears in India. And I've gone through the old literature and, the books and the accounts from the hunters and so on, and they never talk about sloth bears in the hill country. So that's a very interesting question. And I wonder whether it has something to do with perhaps the species of termites that they feed on. It's a great academic question.
Brings me to my next question, which is, you showed that the bears are specialized for feeding on termites. Is that all they eat? Because we hear so much about bears eating fruits and various other things as
yes, they eat a lot of other things, okay? So I would say fairly generalized in the diet, but termites are a year-round staple for them at Waskamua. When it gets to the dry season, when you have Vira and Palu around, you'll see a lot of that in the scats, but you will still see termites. So, because termites is something that is pretty much there year-round. I think it is a staple that the bears really depend on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this amazing presentation. I had a question. Have you also learned something what you can do when a sloth bear comes for you? So if you go to the United States or something like that, they provide you a whole list of do this and that when the bear comes for you? Or are they just so aggressive that there really is nothing people can do when you get to the confrontation?
If a bear is slowly approaching you, there's a good possibility that the bear doesn't know that you're there. And so the first thing that you could do is to try to quietly move out of the way. But if you have a charge and the bear makes physical contact, then I would follow what they do in the United States with a brown bear attack, and that is basically get your hands behind your neck, okay? I've talked about it in the paper on sloth bear conflicts. One way is to ball up, but Steve Herrero, who is the expert now on bear attacks, he says if you lie flat on the ground, face down on the ground with your hands locked behind your neck, it's very difficult for the bear to roll you over. And so he suggests that you do that. I would be very inclined to ball up and protect myself. But the one thing that I would not advocate is fighting the bear. because you want to reduce the perception of threat on the bear's part. And so not challenging the bear and trying to fight it is probably in your best interest. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Madam, for your talk. Basically, if you look at the injuries of the people, it's mostly in the face, which means that the bear was standing, I suppose, and attacking them from behind.
So what I found was that it was fairly rare for a bear to stand up and attack a person. Most of the attacks, the bear charged, barreled into the person, knocked him down, and then attacked. And we had a fair number of injuries to the head, okay? But a lot of the injuries were where the person was using his arms or his legs to protect the face. And so we had a lot of broken arms and broken wrists and missing fingers. And sometimes you had no injuries to the head at all. We had a man who lost an arm, no injuries to the head. Very variable, but bears, when they fight with each other, they attack each other's heads, and I think that's one of the reasons why when they attack a person, they attack the head.
There's
A glitch with the... You want to come here and ask? Yeah.
There's a question from a participant on Zoom that's asking, why aren't there bears in the African continent?
On the African continent, there were bears, okay? They're extinct now. I think some of the giant cave bears might have occurred in Africa. But Africa, there were bears, historically there were bears, okay, on the African continent, all the way down to South Africa. There are none now. I'm not sure why.
There's a question from WNPS. We noticed that the last research has been done with you in 2004.
Yes.
Is there anyone in Sri Lanka currently doing work on bears, on sloth bears in Sri Lanka?
There might be. I'm not aware, I'm really not aware of anyone doing a focused research on sloth bears, but I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure that there is data being collected, that ancillary data, okay, where you're working on another question and you collect data on bears at the same time. So I think there might be, there's bear data out there, okay, that's recent. Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, that was an excellent lecture, Shamala.
Thank you.
It answered just about every question I had, except I go back to a question that I asked you years ago. Does the sloth bear mainly attack with its arms and claws, or does it attack with the mouth? And I think you said more with the
teeth,
biting. Yes.
the teeth. So most of the injuries, okay, the severe injuries were inflicted by the teeth of the bear. But I did have a few cases where a man reported the bear hit him across the face with his paw, and his eye actually went through the bone and went into the sinus below the orbit of the eye. The force of the blow was that hard. So because the paws are extremely, and the forelimbs are extremely powerful to break into these strong termite mounds, I'm sure that a bear can easily take your face off with a swipe of the paw or disembowel you. But the MO for most of the attack seems to be the bear charging, the person falls down, you literally have the force of the bear knocking the man or the woman over. Most of the people were men. And then the bear attacks, okay, either the head or the whatever you can get a hold of.
We have time for two more questions. There's one over here. So.
I'm so glad you're asking questions. I was worried that nobody would want to ask me any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ratnayeke, for your talk. I'm
Yeah.
curious if during your research there were folks who were recommending or pursuing alternate non-forest-based livelihoods and what the obstacles were to those, or why they felt obliged to keep going into the forest to pursue their livelihood.
So the question is, were there people that were pursuing non-forest-based livelihoods? Not that I'm aware of. You mean in terms of like NGOs, right? Working with people around the villages?
No, based on your recommendation for people to stay out of the forest and have for a secure livelihood that wouldn't require them to go into the forest.
See, that's the thing. I didn't actually ask about that because I felt that people were using whatever options were available to survive. And so I didn't feel like it was my place to say, okay, don't go into the forest. And we can't achieve conservation that way. What we have to do is to create opportunities where people have a more secure lifestyle, where they don't have to rely on the rains for their crops and wild animals coming in, taking off part of their crops and so on. And they have another form of livelihood. I mean, this is driving human-wildlife conflict all over the world. You know, these are people that are settling on the edges of national parks and having conflict with elephants and with bears and lions and tigers and so on. Yeah.
Thank you.
One more question.
Yeah. Thank you for that marvelous lecture that you gave. And I have one question. Thank you for that fantastic lecture that you gave. And I have this one question, like going into a forest, what would we fear more, a leopard attack or a bear? Which is more fearful?
Can somebody repeat that question for me? I think the mic was not working.
Okay.
A bear attack, okay? People are, I think the only other thing to equal a bear is a rogue elephant in terms of what people are afraid of. And people were very afraid of bears. In fact, some of the hunters told me if they saw fresh bear tracks when they were on a trail, they turned back. They didn't want to take the risk of encountering a bear.
So thank you, Dr. Shamla. Thank you, Dr. Shamla, for that wonderful presentation. I'm sure you've heard that so many times over the past few minutes. So I'm not going to take too much time reiterating the same thing. But I would like to say that over the past few days, we've had so many people, young and old, ask us about your presentation, your lecture that was coming up. So that was the amount of enthusiasm they were, waiting for, looking forward to today. So thank you for taking your time and accepting our invitation to come and make this presentation today. Thank you very much. On behalf of the Wildlife and Nature Protection Society, thank you very much. And to all of you, I'd like to remind you that Dr. Shamala's book is available for purchase today. The Sloth Bear, the Barefoot Bear of Sri Lanka. This is going at a very special price today, 9,700 rupees. But if you were to buy this at the Barefoot Gallery, it would be priced at 12,200. So I would recommend that you make use of this opportunity to buy this book today. You could also get it personalized, signed by her this evening. So do take that opportunity. And we'd like to before we wind up, one more announcement from WNPS. As I mentioned at the start, we have a survey that's going on today that has been done not to take much of your time, maybe 2 minutes at the most. So do take the time to fill it up. This is a survey on future field trips. We want to take a different take to it, give it a different flavor. We'd like to know your ideas, whether you would like to take a hike with us, go up a mountain, go explore the mangroves. So just give us your ideas. We'd like to explore them and see how we could better the field trip experience that we give you. And lastly, I would like to call Dr. Shamala for a moment. If you could step forward, please. And Mr. Petyagoda, if you could also come here, please. We have a small token of appreciation from WNPS.